Hi friends, welcome to The Objective Hindu. Today I'm excited to be back to share in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so with you my reactions to the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, the media has already declared Joe Biden dead as part of the sort of reporting, and most of it is focused on his age and his gaffes and whether he was coherent in his responses. But I think there's more at play, and there were very serious issues that were raised by the debate moderators, and I want to focus on actually what Donald Trump had to say about them, especially because he is the challenger, and so he needs to propose policies that are either better or at least sound at the face of it to be prospectively better than what the incumbent government has come up with. So I'm going to look at 5 or 6 of these big questions that were raised. Obviously there were more questions than 5 or 6 in the 1.5 hour debate, but we'll focus on these, and I'll offer you some critical perspective and also focus mostly on what Trump had to say. So the first one was around inflation, and then there was a question on debt. And the question really was around, it was addressed to Biden first as to what are you doing? America is still reeling with inflation. In short, Biden's response was in 2 parts. One was that he accused Trump of handing him a mess, aka a dead economy. So he blames Trump to begin with to some extent, which is, I guess, understandable being politicians. And then he goes on to list some of the measures that they have undertaken. Now, when it's Trump's turn, Trump basically says that, what are you talking about, Mr. Biden? I handed you a perfect economy and everything was fine when I left office. Now, there is a little bit of truth to that. There wasn't very high inflation when Donald Trump left office. But what we need to understand is that the reason there is inflation today is very much the sort of policies that Donald Trump and his government implemented during the pandemic. And most of this relates to the fiscal stimulus, almost $6 trillion of new debt, and essentially money being pumped into the economy, which takes some time to have an impact. So the fact that inflation is more severe after Trump led office does not mean that therefore the next party is to blame. In many cases, the next party is actually inheriting the long tail effects of what the previous party did, especially when you talk about macroeconomic sort of questions. The other question there was, Biden said that Trump has added the highest amount of net debt that any president in a 4-year term has added. So that's statement 1. Trump said that Biden is in office sitting over the largest debt that any president in history has. So if you think about these 2 sentences critically, what Trump is saying is actually misleading. Any president in US history, any successor president will always have more debt that he will or she will sit over, unless they've somehow managed to reduce debt, which almost no one manages to do in the modern world, in the United States today at least. So every successive president will almost by definition have more debt that they have. The question is, how much more net debt have they added? Have they at least slowed down? Which Biden has, by the way. And Biden's statement is factually accurate. Trump, especially during because you can say because of the COVID pandemic, maybe you can say during the COVID pandemic, took on far more debt than any other US president in the history of that country. And my particular comment here, which is slightly aside from who's right and who's wrong, is that Trump is part of the Republican Party. And this entire inflationary crisis is now a result of the policies that Trump and the Republican Party endorsed and implemented during the pandemic years. And the question that we forget to ask is, when did the Republicans become socialists? This idea of printing money, providing fiscal stimulus, and essentially Keynesian economics, when did the Republican Party start doing this sort of stuff? This is not their party's position. This is what the Democrats are meant to do. And I thought that neither Biden cornered Trump on this question, although he wouldn't, of course, and nor did, in the absence of the moderators actually asking any critical questions, nor did Trump answer this very well. So moving on to the second issue, which was around immigration and the crisis on the southern border, so the border in Texas, etc. So we know that 18 million illegal people have come into the US in the last 3 years. So that's a massive number. So this is a real problem. It's a big immigration issue. But there's a challenge again here, because the conversation becomes very quickly emotional. And it reminds me a little bit of what happens with Congress and BJP in India. And if you're aware of the context in which I'm making this reference, you'll immediately see where I'm going with this. So when Biden's asked about this question, he talks about essentially again policies and spending more money on border patrolling and asylum officers, etc. And he ends up with some sort of a statistic where he says that there's a 40% decline in net new illegal immigration. Now, when Trump, who's supposedly hard on immigration, etc., when he's asked the same question, he starts rabble-rousing and he doesn't have a policy response. His first comment is that I gave you a perfect border and there was no illegal immigration when I left office. Now, that's nonsense. That's not true. There's always been illegal immigration. Also, by the way, remember, he said he's going to build a wall there. He never built that wall, and it was a stupid idea because there are many ways to circumvent those sort of measures. But then he says that Biden's the worst president in history. Whether he is or he's not is a very difficult question to answer, and a different topic. And that he's opened up the border and he's allowing all sorts of terrorists and criminals to come into the country, and that those terrorists are killing Americans in the hundreds and the thousands. Now, I think this is nonsense, and I think this is very misleading, and I think it trivializes a very serious issue. There is an immigration challenge. There's an illegal immigration challenge. There's also a legal immigration challenge, which none of them talked about. But the sort of emotional story and saying that the criminals are coming in and they're going to kill you and they're going to rape you, and this is exactly what Donald Trump said, by the way. I'm not making this up. I think that trivializes the issue, and I think that again doesn't talk about anything to do with proper policies. He then goes on to say that the Border Patrol agency endorses me, the guards endorse me, and therefore I'm the better choice. While he might be a better choice in some of these affairs, I don't think that's a very convincing sort of answer. And plus, I don't really acknowledge I don't think I think Trump in particular did not acknowledge the seriousness of the issue. This immigration issue, this is my point of view now, this issue is a bipartisan issue. No president can solve this in the United States unless both parties come to the table and say that it makes no sense to have 18 million people come into our country. And the way we are going to solve this problem is not by blaming each other, and it's not by saying that all these people are criminals, because they're not. Yes, their propensity might be slightly higher than that of an average American, but I think there'll be many, many smart and hardworking people in those 18 million. So let's say they're not criminals. What do you do then? Is it okay to have non-criminals immigrating? So it's not an issue of whether you're a criminal or a terrorist. It's an issue of whether you have the right to enter that country in the way you did. And what does that do to the rights of those who are trying to do so legally? And again, the second point, I alluded to this briefly. None of them talked about the legal immigration challenge. The question was not necessarily only about illegal immigration, it was about immigration. The immigration system, the legal immigration system in America has been broken for many years. It's one of the only major countries where there's no merit-based immigration system. Every president always promises this. There's been no action on this. Again, it's not possible unless it's a bipartisan sort of initiative, in my opinion. And this sort of rabble-rousing and accusing the other person of basically knowing nothing and claiming that everything was just perfect during my era, I think that's just nonsense. They were also asked about deportation, and then I think Trump vacillated and he went on to some different issue first, and again he was bashing Biden about something previously that he said, and then he says that Social Security, which is the social security system in the US, which is essentially the public safety net for unemployed and older people, that will die, which it probably will. So this is where the Congress BJP thing comes in. In Indian perspective, the BJP or the right is often accusing the Congress of being soft on illegal immigration, especially from Bangladesh, and how we allow, in many cases, those people to settle and become voters. It's a little bit of that same claim. So I see some merit in what he's saying. But what he misses is any sort of reference to what about the millions of legal immigrants who are still struggling to find, a smooth, efficient pathway to live in the United States based on their skills or their qualifications or a combination of both. Again, they've all paid lip service to this. Nothing has been done. Okay, so moving on to the third point, which is around abortion. So you're probably aware that during Trump's presidential reign, the historical Roe versus Wade judgment of the US Supreme Court was overturned. And what that essentially means is that the power to dictate abortion laws has been handed back to the states. So every state can have its own law. Now, Trump's position on this was very simple. He was asked, what do you think of this? He's like, this is the best thing. And I'm very happy that this happened. I mean, he kind of instigated it because he put some conservative justices on the Supreme Court bench. And so, he sort of handpicked people who he knew would vote in this particular direction, that is to overturn Roe versus Wade. But he then starts saying something pretty ridiculous, because then he says that for the last 51 years, since this has been in existence, every legal scholar has said that it should remain with the states. Well, that's not true, because the Supreme Court did uphold it 51 years ago, and presumably they were also legal scholars in the Supreme Court back then. So while I kind of appreciate the fact that the US Constitution is a little gray on this topic, his claim to fame, Trump is saying, and this is a Republican position, might I add, he's saying that this is a matter for the states to decide. People will vote in their independent states. Now, Biden makes a very different point. Sorry, before I move on to Biden, Trump doesn't articulate his own position on this at all. So he doesn't say anything about what he thinks in terms of the abortion policy and what's right versus what's wrong, the sort of moral question and the legal question. He doesn't get into that at all. He just says, go figure it out state by state. I don't necessarily mind that, but I just wanted to make that point. Biden says that he very much supports Roe versus Wade, which means he actually supports a universal system and a legal framework across all states in the US. He makes a great point around, the argument of giving this back to the states, the power to make these decisions, would be akin to making the argument that civil rights should be handed back to the states. So every state can decide its own civil right liberties. So, in some states, blacks can be slaves. In other states, they can't be slaves. Would that be acceptable to us? And if that's not acceptable, how can we accept something like this today? So I think that was a powerful point, and he's essentially advocating that this is a universal value that needs to be upheld, which is exactly the principle under which Roe versus Wade was first implemented. But then Biden goes down the track of healthcare and it's a women's health issue, and that he does say that it's not a political issue. The politicians should be making the decisions between the doctor and the woman. But even he steers clear of any sort of philosophical or moral commentary. For example, he does not say anything on the lines of it's a woman's right to decide what she might want to do with a child. I don't think he can go that far, because he still has a large Christian conservative vote base, even though he's the Democratic nominee president. But he doesn't take any clear stance on whether it is right or wrong to do so in the first place. He just says that Roe versus Wade was fine and that it provided a good baseline. Now Trump here jumps in, and again there's rabble rousing, and then he starts saying things like the Democrats are extremists and that they want to rip out babies. I'm quoting him verbatim, that they want to rip out babies from the wombs of the mothers in the 8th and 9th month, and maybe even after birth. Now again, there's no law that allows for someone to be ripped out. Yes, there are certain situations in which there might be late-term abortions, and those are difficult issues to debate. But they should be debated, and the larger question is under what circumstances is what permitted. And the thing that was missing in the entire question around abortion was, well, what is your moral position? If you take the Christian moral position, well, the answer will be, well, you can't really do an abortion. If you take the extreme left moral position, the answer will be you can always do an abortion. And maybe there's a middle ground there, and Roe versus Wade was, I thought, a reasonable middle ground for a country like the US. But again, in summary, Trump's commentary was full of rabble-rousing and accusations, and he basically just said things that were not true about the Democrats. Okay, moving on. This is one of my favorites, Russia-Ukraine war, and then Israel-Gaza as well. Now, he's asked this question, Trump is asked this question about the war, and then he doesn't answer the question. He talks about the US veterans and the US military and the fact that they all hate Biden. I don't know where he got that from, but anyway, that's what he starts with it. Then he says that if he was in power, there would be no war. Then he goes into Afghanistan and says that, well, Biden ran away from Afghanistan. I could have done it better, blah, 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 blah. Then he basically talks about Kiev and all the beautiful domes and the iconic structures being destroyed. Nothing about the war, by the way, so far. And then his time's up. And then Biden talks, about the US support for Ukraine, which, by the way, later Trump counters and says that we're paying them too much money. And then Biden says we're not paying them money, we're actually paying them in arms, so there's actually no cash involved, etc. But Biden tries to articulate his policy and the fact that he's doing this with the alliances that they have in Europe. Then the moderator in the second sort of round, so there's the first 2-minute segment and Trump doesn't answer the question, reminds Trump that the question is, what are the the terms that Putin is now asking the West to sort of accept and Ukraine to accept, are those acceptable to you? And then finally Trump says no. And then again he starts talking about other issues and the fact that Zelensky is a salesman. And then he starts bashing the Europeans for not doing their fair share. Now again, there's a little bit of truth to the fact that NATO and the funding to NATO has been, America has been the largest source. But it would be also worth noting at this stage that the entire NATO project is an American project. And the push to get countries like the Ukraine into NATO, which is in my opinion one of the root causes why Russia has invaded Ukraine, are American policies. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't say to the Europeans that you guys are not paying while America continues to be the dominant sort of hegemon that dictates NATO policy. I mean, the NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Ukraine is nowhere close to the North Atlantic, so it makes no sense for a country like Ukraine to be part of NATO. Now, maybe you call it something else if that's what you want. But American foreign policy has dictated NATO, including the inclusion or the pushing of countries like Ukraine into the NATO sort of framework. And if you can't have it both ways by saying that, well, we want Ukraine in NATO or Sweden or Finland, but we don't want to pay anymore as much as we did previously. Europeans, you should pay. Well, Europeans didn't really want Ukraine in NATO. That was an American ploy, which has resulted, at least partially resulted in this particular conflict. And then when the Israel-Gaza question is asked, again, he vacillates, goes on to something else. And then he just says in one sentence, I'll have to have a look at it. So this is a question around Palestinian statehood. And Trump's response is, I'll have to have a look at it. He has nothing to say on the question. Again, he goes back to accusing Biden of being the worst president on earth, but nothing on the question of two states or, coming up with some sort of a solution for the crisis. And I'm not necessarily endorsing one solution or the other. I'm just saying that his response was, I will have to look at it. Well, you should have looked at it before showing up for a debate where this question would be asked, would be my comment on his response. He's also then asked about democracy and the handover of power in terms of, because you remember the last time his supporters ran amok at Capitol Hill, and he refuses to, go into the topic. He says again things like on January 6th, January 6th is when the last elections happened, the results were announced, that on January 6th we had a great border, we had a great economy, we had low taxes, we were respected all over the world. The question that's been asked is, will you hand over power peacefully, and will you condemn all sorts of violence? And he doesn't respond to that. And then he again goes on a rant against Biden. And some of the things that he says are probably, worth talking about, but they were not pertinent to the question, as the same sort of pattern that we saw in some of the other questions. And then he's asked thrice, and he's pushed again and again and again. And then finally, at the end of the debate, not as part of these questions, he actually does say, but what does he say? He says that if it's a fair election, yes, I will agree. Now that sounds a little bit like what I hear in the Indian elections, where we have electronic voting machines, EVMs, where the opposition often says that EVMs are rigged or they're hacked. But they only say that when they lose the elections. In many cases, they win elections with those same EVMs, and in that case, obviously, the EVMs work fine. So essentially, Trump is saying the same thing, which is that if I win, it's a fair election. If I lose, then of course it's a rigged election. At this point, I think Biden calls him a whiner, which I think is a very accurate description of, And again, some of the attacks on Trump from a legal perspective and all these cases against him, I think those are quite outrageous, and I think Trump should have brought those up. But I didn't think he did himself any favors by not using the opportunity to respond to this question very cleanly and clearly and pragmatically, and say that he could have even said that we need to work towards a fairer election system, and that it's a national priority. But he just goes on this rant, and essentially the best he can do is to say that if it's fair, I will agree. But he of course doesn't define what is fair, and you can take a guess that in his mind fairness means if I win, it is fair. Global warming and climate change. Now this is very close to my own heart, and this is just, it was a joke. One of the most important questions. So now Biden acknowledges that this is an existential crisis for human beings. He talks about the laws he's created. He talks about the fact that he's rejoined the Paris climate accords that Trump pulled out of. And, he says what he does. Now, whether you agree with him or not, he outlines his policies. Can you can you imagine what was Trump's response? Trump's response was that when I was in office, we had the cleanest air and water, and I gave it to this guy, and he's destroyed it essentially, like everything else. Now, what has the quality of water in, let's say, a part of the United States got to do with global emissions and the problems that, let's say, the developing worlds are facing with, fossil fuel dependency, etc.? And he then says that I love pristine air and I like pristine water, and on Jan 6th we have pristine air and pristine water. So on Jan 6th, America and the global climate crisis was not a crisis, and now when Biden's in power, it's become a crisis. So he had nothing to say on such a significant issue. And then he goes on, wrapping the Paris Climate Accords, saying that we are the only ones who've got to pay, and Russia doesn't have to pay, and China doesn't have to pay, and India doesn't have to pay, which is partially correct, but he misses the point. You've got to pay because you've consumed more than your fair share of global carbon footprint. And the developed world has to pay so that the developing world doesn't make the same mistakes that the developed world has. So when someone says you've got to pay, it sounds pretty outrageous, but it's actually not like someone's just doling out cash. It's part of a larger framework and a multilateral agreement, because there's only one Earth. And if the developing countries do not help, if the developed countries do not help the developing countries, then we're not going to meet those targets. And so I think Trump totally trivialized this issue. Again, I'm not necessarily concerned with whether Biden's policies are sound or not. My point is that he at least outlined some policies. Trump ended with something as ridiculous as that there's clean water when I left office. That's akin to saying there is no climate change because it snowed in New York last week or something like that. So that was, I think, ridiculous, and I lost whatever little respect I had for him on this particular answer. Same thing happened, by the way, on childcare. The questions about childcare and families are struggling, and Trump spends half the time talking about the people he's fired from the US bureaucracy, which generals he's fired, nothing on childcare, spends all his time. Then the moderator comes in and says that, by the way, you have some time left. Do you actually want to respond to the question? And again, after the moderators asked him this question about childcare, Trump says, and you can listen to this, he says, I was the best president in history, and that Biden's the worst president in history, and here are the surveys. So nothing on childcare, despite two specific questions that the moderator asked. Biden did his part, and he talked about the tax credits, etc., and some of the support that the Democratic Party is offering as part for working families, where there are financial pressures and where families need help in terms of the costs of childcare. Again, I'm not saying whether those policies are great or not, but at least he talked about policies. Trump talked about he being the best president and firing bureaucrats and army generals, etc., on a question that was about childcare. And he was twice quizzed, and both times he failed. Similar thing happened on the opioid crisis. So in America, there's a massive drug crisis at the moment with, fentanyl, I think, is the main drug so I think 100,000 people are dying every year because of overdose, and this number has gone up year on year, both during Trump and Biden's presidencies. So it's a serious issue. It's a bipartisan issue. This question is asked to Trump first. Trump starts with the deficit, which I've already explained is a misleading claim. Then he says that Biden is a Chinese candidate and that he's on China's payroll. This is a question about the opioid crisis, by the way. Then the moderator reminds Trump of the question that it's about the opioid crisis. Then Trump responds by talking about COVID. Now the questions about the drug overdose crisis, he's talking about COVID, and essentially ends up with the same conclusion that everything was fine during my time. And then he moves on to immigration and Mexico. Now, arguably there is a little bit of connection with immigration and Mexico, because of course, there's one of the sources is through the porous border on the south. But opioid related deaths were increasing in Trump's term as well. And even if he actually has some solutions, this would be the time to talk about it, rather than talking about deficit and COVID and all sorts of unrelated sort of topics when such an important question is being raised. And then he actually brings in Putin and how he's going to end the war in Ukraine before becoming president, and how he's going to free some jailed reporter somewhere before becoming president. So he actually says the questions about the opioid crisis, he's talking about Putin. And then he says that when he will be the president-elect, so he's just won the election, has not yet taken oath, he will finish the war in Ukraine. Magically, of course, no one can ask him how. And then he also says that he will free some jailed reporter somewhere. And then he jumps on to some sort of ridiculous issues with Biden paying too much ransom money or something. All of this is part of a question around the opioid crisis. Biden again talks about this in much greater detail. Whether you agree with his policies or not, at least he attempts to answer them. Not one word from Trump on the entire issue. So look, in summary, what's happened? What's happened is that America deserves better. We are looking at candidates who are, in case of Donald Trump, in the current environment, I do have a slightly right-leaning disposition, because I think the federal government in the US is highly inefficient. It's too large, it's bloated, and I think we need a smaller government, which is really what the Republican Party stood for. But Trump had nothing to say on any of these topics. His entire debate was about attacking Biden as the worst president in history. He challenges him to a round of golf. He brings in Putin. He says that I will stop the war even before I become president. I don't know how. He doesn't respond to questions on childcare. He says that the water was pristine when he left office, and so the global climate crisis is not a crisis anymore. He has nothing to say on the opioid crisis. This was just an abomination of a debate from someone who's, clearly one of the leading candidates in the United States. I think, again, I'm not spending too much time on Biden. He's got his own problems, and he's the incumbent, of course. And I think Trump should have challenged him on some of the real issues like culture wars, the extreme woke leftist movements, what's happening in the US universities, and how the Democratic Party has not been able to stand up to all this freedom of speech, the BLM movement, nothing. None of these issues that Trump should have legitimately cornered Biden on were even raised. Even though, he took every opportunity to talk about everything under the sun, none of this came up. And really what in my opinion is now happening is Trump is playing to his audience, and his audience are actually galvanized by his lunacy. His voters actually reward him for being insane. So I think he knows that. I think he knows that not a single person is going to vote for him based on any sort of factual or objective information. So given that constraint, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go down the rabble-rousing conspiracy theory path, and that's exactly what he did. And in Biden, you have a fairly old establishment style candidate who, versus Trump, he seems very much more mature and far more sane, definitely. But what America is left with is a person who can barely construct his sentences, cannot talk about the most difficult issues of his time, including, the extreme leftist movements or climate change or, the inflation problems, etc. I'm talking about Biden here. Biden struggled on these topics too. And of course, Trump refused to answer any questions on them. So what choice do the American people have? They have to choose, as someone very eloquently said, between a con man and an old man. And I really feel sad as a well-wisher for the American people, and a country that has had a great tradition of freewheeling debates and good policies and robust sort of critiques, that this is what they've reached, and a sort of, it's a nadir, it's a low point in their politics. And I don't know whether Biden will pull out of the race or not. It doesn't matter. I think the fact that roughly half the country is going to vote for Trump after this particular debate actually tells me that it doesn't matter who the candidate is. It's a totally emotional sort of appeal that's going to work both on the left and on the right. And I really wish that the American people had better choices, and that they responded to far more objective policy-based discussions than they clearly seem to be doing today. Well, I hope you found this sort of reaction and my critique of this debate useful. Feel free to share it if you did. And please continue to subscribe to the channel and tune in for the next set of videos that I'll create very shortly. But for today, that's all, and thanks for joining.